The whip's crack was the only sound that mattered. It split the night air, a sound sharper than the wind, hotter than the freezing mud that was already sucking at Clara's bare feet. The second strike, a blistering line of fire across her back, had been the one that broke her. Not her skin, but the last frayed thread of whatever hope had kept her tethered to the merchant's wagon. He had been drinking, his words slurring into a venomous promise. A rancher outside Laramie pays good silver for a girl with a strong back and a weak will. You'll fetch a fine price. She had not waited for the third strike. While he fumbled with the leather straps, his breath a foul cloud of whiskey in the cold, she had bolted, not toward the road, not toward anything familiar, but into the endless, swallowing darkness of the Wyoming Territory. The flimsy cotton of her shift was no match for the branches that clawed at her, tearing thin red lines into her arms and legs. Her feet, soft from months spent mending clothes in the back of a cramped wagon, were sliced open by rocks and thorns she could not see. Each step was a fresh agony, but the pain was a distant drumbeat compared to the terror that spurred her on. The merchant's laughter, a low, guttural sound, seemed to chase her through the trees. She ran until her lungs burned with the icy air and the muscles in her legs screamed in protest. When she could run no more, she crawled into a thicket of sagebrush, pulling the sharp-smelling branches over her body like a shroud. The world was a canvas of black and gray, the moon a sliver of bone hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. Every rustle of leaves was the merchant's heavy footfall. Every hoot of an owl was his drunken call. She pressed her face into the dirt, tasting grit and her own salty tears, and prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Sometime later, she heard the heavy thud of horses' hooves on the dirt track not far from where she hid. 2 riders. Their voices were low murmurs, carried on the wind. She held her breath, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. Were they looking for her? Had he sent them? She squeezed her eyes shut, imagining the rough hands that would drag her back to the wagon, back to the whip, back to the sail. But the sound of the horses faded, leaving her once more in the profound and terrifying silence of the wilderness. The cold was a living thing. It seeped through her thin dress, into her bones, making her teeth chatter so violently she had to bite her lip to quiet the sound. Blood from the cuts on her feet had begun to freeze, a crust of black against her pale skin. Hunger was a dull, twisting ache in her belly. She had not eaten since the morning's stale biscuit. She thought of a warm fire, of a thick blanket, of a slice of bread with butter. The thoughts were a form of torture, ghosts of a life that was not hers, and perhaps never would be. She huddled deeper into the sage, her body shaking uncontrollably, and drifted into a state that was not quite sleep, but a numb surrender to the misery of the passing hours. Dawn broke not with a glorious sunrise, but with a slow, gray leaking of light that revealed a world drained of color. The sky was the color of slate, the land a frozen expanse of brown and muted green. Frost coated everything, a delicate, cruel lacework of ice on every blade of grass, every branch, every stone. Clara pushed herself to her feet, her body a single, unified cry of pain. The welts on her back were stiff and raw, chafing against the rough fabric of her shift with every movement. Her feet were numb, blue-tinged things she could barely feel. She had to move. To stay still was to die. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to put distance between herself and the merchant's path. She stumbled forward, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of life, any wisp of smoke that might mean a hearth and a chance at mercy. The land was vast and empty, a rolling sea of hard, unforgiving earth that seemed to mock her smallness, her insignificance. She walked for what felt like an eternity, fueled by a primal instinct to survive that she did not know she possessed. The sun, a weak, watery disk in the sky, offered no warmth. Her hunger had become a hollow, painful void. She chewed on a few bitter leaves from a bush, the taste acrid on her tongue. but it did nothing to quiet the gnawing in her stomach. By midday, a dizzying weakness had taken hold. The world began to tilt and sway, the horizon blurring at the edges. It was then that she saw it, far in the distance. Nestled against a low rise of hills was a small, dark shape. A building. Hope. A feeling so foreign it was almost painful, flickered in her chest. She fixed her eyes on the shape, a dot in the immense landscape, and forced her legs to keep moving. One foot in front of the other. That was all that mattered. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a rough-built barn and a small, squat cabin next to it, a thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. The sight was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. But with hope came a new wave of fear. Who lived here? What kind of person chose to build a life so far from everything? Would they be kind? Or would they see her as she was? A ragged, bleeding stray, worth less than nothing? Her legs gave out before she could reach the cabin door. She had made it as far as the barn, her hand reaching for the weathered gray wood of the wall as if to anchor herself. But her strength was gone. The world dissolved into a swirl of gray and brown, and she collapsed onto the frozen ground. The rough texture of the frost a final, sharp sensation against her cheek before everything went black. The first thing she felt was a gentle warmth, a stark contrast to the biting cold she had last remembered. The second was a dull, throbbing pain that radiated from her back and feet. She blinked her eyes open, her vision blurry. She was lying on a hard-planked floor. A coarse wool blanket draped over her. A fire crackled in a stone hearth nearby, casting a warm, flickering glow across the small, one-room cabin. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something savory, like stew. A man stood over her. He was tall, his frame lean and hard beneath a simple flannel shirt and worn denim trousers. His face was all harsh angles and shadows in the firelight, his jaws set, his mouth a straight, unsmiling line. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were guarded, missing nothing. He held a rifle in the crook of his arm, not pointing it at her, but holding it with a casual familiarity that suggested it was an extension of his body. He did not look angry. He did not look anything at all. He just watched her, his silence a heavy weight in the room. Clara scrambled backward, crab-walking across the floor until her back hit the rough-hewn wall of the cabin, the movement sending a jolt of agony through her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was where her desperate flight ended. "Please," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. Her throat was parched. "Please, sir, do not hurt me." Her eyes filled with tears, blurring his imposing figure. "I did not mean to trespass. I was lost. I saw your smoke." The words tumbled out, a frantic, pathetic plea for her life. "I can work. I swear it. I am strong. I can cook and clean, mend clothes, haul water, anything. Just give me a bit of food. A place out of the cold. I will not be a burden. I swear it." She curled into herself, making her body as small as possible, a posture of submission she had learned long ago. She was waiting for the blow, for the harsh words, for him to drag her back outside and leave her to the elements. The silent man simply watched her, his expression unreadable. He took a step closer, and she flinched. A small, involuntary movement. He stopped. His gaze flickered from her face to her torn and bloodied feet, then back again. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Clara held her breath, convinced he was deciding her fate. Then he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It was only 2 words. "Come home." Clara stared at him, bewildered. Had she heard him correctly? It made no sense. This was not her home. She had no home. He gestured with his head toward the fire. He was not telling her to leave. He was inviting her in. He turned his back on her then, leaning the rifle against the wall near the door. He walked over to the hearth and ladled a thick, steaming stew into a wooden bowl. Standing beside him, staring at Clara with wide, curious eyes, was a young boy, no older than 6 or 7. He had the same dark hair as the man, the same serious expression on his small face. He clutched a small, carved wooden horse in one hand, his thumb tucked into his mouth. He did not smile. He just watched her, his gaze as steady and unnerving as his father's. The man set the bowl of stew on a small, crude table, along with a piece of dark bread. He did not look at her again. He picked up an axe from beside the door and walked outside, shutting the door softly behind him, leaving Clara alone with the boy and the silence. Slowly, hesitantly, Clara pushed herself to her feet. Every muscle ached. She limped over to the table, her eyes darting toward the boy, who still had not moved. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing sound in the quiet cabin. She sat down and picked up the spoon. The stew was simple, mostly potatoes, carrots, and a few small pieces of tough meat, but it was hot and filling. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, greedily, not stopping until the bowl was empty. She sopped up the last of the gravy with the bread, her hunger a raw, desperate need. When she was finished, she looked at the boy. He had moved from the hearth and was now sitting on a small stool in the corner, still watching her. He had not said a word. Clara felt a strange, unsettling mix of gratitude and confusion. The man had offered her shelter, food. He had spoken to her not with cruelty, but with an almost baffling simplicity. Yet, his silence was a fortress, his expression a locked door. She did not understand him. She did not understand what he wanted from her, but for the first time in days, she was warm. She was fed. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. The ranch, if it could be called that, was a testament to a hard-fought existence. The paths were thick with mud that clung to her worn-out shoes. A constant, biting wind swept down from the hills, rattling the cabin's single window and finding its way through the chinks in the log walls. Barbed wire fences, sharp and rusted, sectioned off a small pasture where a handful of bony cattle huddled together for warmth. The soil was rocky and unforgiving. Everything about this place spoke of struggle. Her host, Elijah Kane, she learned his name when the boy, Nate, whispered it one afternoon, remained a mystery. He was a ghost in his own home, rising before the sun and returning after dark, his face and hands smudged with dirt. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, whether he was chopping wood, mending a fence post, or cleaning his rifle, but he rarely spoke. A nod was a conversation, a gesture was a command. Most of the time, he was simply a silent, brooding presence. He never asked her to do anything. He never told her the rules of the house. He simply existed, and allowed her to exist alongside him. Clara, terrified of being seen as useless, of being cast out back into the cold, began to work. She did not need to be asked. She saw the pile of firewood dwindling and began hauling logs from the woodpile to the cabin, her arms straining, her back screaming in protest. She found a basket of mending, Nate's torn trousers, one of Elijah's shirts with a button missing, and set to work with a needle and thread she found in a small tin box. Her stitches were small and neat, a skill learned out of necessity. She tried to cook, but her efforts were clumsy. The bread she attempted to bake was hard as a rock. The stews were thin and tasteless. But she did not give up. She scrubbed the cast-iron pans until they shone, swept the rough planked floor every morning, and kept the fire fed. She was trying to earn her keep, to build a wall of usefulness around herself that would make her too valuable to discard. At night, when the cabin was dark, and the only sounds were the sighing of the wind and the soft breathing of the boy in his small cot, Clara would cry. She lay on a thin pallet of straw and blankets near the hearth, turning her face to the wall so no one would hear the silent tears that streamed down her face. She cried for the life she had lost, for the parents she barely remembered, for the years of servitude and fear. She cried for the welts on her back that were slowly beginning to heal, leaving behind raised, ropey scars that she knew would never fade. One night, as she lay there, her body shaking with silent sobs, she felt something touch her shoulder. She froze. It was a small, warm weight, peeking over her shoulder. She saw Nate standing beside her pallet, his face a solemn silhouette in the dying firelight. He had placed his own small, patched blanket over her. He did not say anything. He just looked at her for a moment with his father's serious eyes, then padded back to his cot. The simple, childish act of kindness was so unexpected, so pure, that it broke something open inside her, and she cried until there were no tears left. Elijah, too, showed his own form of silent care. He never acknowledged her work, never praised her or criticized her, but in the mornings, she would find an extra biscuit left on the table. After a particularly cold night, a thicker, warmer blanket appeared on her pallet. He said nothing, but he saw everything. His silence was not one of ignorance, but of observation. Her mind often drifted back to the past, to the moments that had led her here. She remembered arriving in Cheyenne, a girl of 16, full of a naive hope for honest work. She had found a position as a laundress in a boarding house, but the owner's son had cornered her in the cellar. His hands rough, his breath sour. She had fled, leaving her meager wages behind. Then there was the job as a seamstress for a woman who paid her in insults and scraps of food, accusing her of stealing when a spool of thread went missing. Each time she tried to build a small, decent life, it was snatched away from her. The world, it seemed, had no place for a woman alone, without money or protection. It saw only a thing to be used, to be taken advantage of, to be broken. That was how she had ended up with the merchant, a man who had promised food and shelter in exchange for mending his wares, a promise that had quickly curdled into something much darker. One evening, Elijah came in later than usual. A snowstorm had blown in, a thick, swirling curtain of white that muffled the world. He was covered in it, his hair and shoulders dusted with snow. He shook the cold from his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. Without a word, he went to the cupboard and brought out a small tin of salve. He walked over to where she sat by the fire, mending one of Nate's socks. He held out the tin. Clara looked up at him, confused. His gaze was directed at her hands. She looked down and saw that they were red and raw, the skin cracked and bleeding from hauling wood and scrubbing pans in cold water. She had not even noticed. She took the tin from him, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused, but surprisingly warm. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, his face unreadable as ever in the flickering firelight. He turned and went to sit at the table, his back to her, leaving her to tend to her own wounds in the quiet warmth of the cabin. It was not kindness as she had ever known it. It was something else, something harder, quieter, and perhaps more real. And in the heart of that vast, unforgiving wilderness, it felt like a fragile beginning. The harshness of the land began to shape her, molding her in ways she had not anticipated. The soft, scared girl who had collapsed in the frost was being worn away, replaced by someone harder, more resilient. Clara learned the rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by the whims of a cruel master. Her day started before dawn, the air sharp and cold in her lungs. She learned to milk the 2 shaggy goats that lived in a small pen behind the barn. At first, her hands were clumsy and weak, the goats skittish and uncooperative, but slowly, she found the right pressure, the steady, rhythmic pull that yielded a stream of warm, frothy milk into the pail. The smell of the animals, a dusty, earthy scent, became familiar, a part of her new life. She learned to boil coffee the way Elijah liked it, strong and black, letting the ground settle at the bottom of the pot. She learned the particular way to scrub the cast iron skillet with salt to keep it seasoned. She took over feeding the small flock of scrawny chickens that scratched in the dirt near the cabin, scattering their feed and gathering the few precious eggs they laid each day. These small tasks were an anchor, a routine that kept her mind from dwelling on the past. The calluses forming on her palms were a shield, proof that she was earning her place. Her body, once thin and weak, grew stronger, her arms and back lean with the muscle of real work. Nate, who had at first been a silent, watchful shadow, slowly began to thaw. He would follow her as she went about her chores, his small bare feet making soft prints in the mud. He would stand just out of reach, watching her with his father's unnervingly steady gaze. Then, he started leaving her small gifts, a perfectly round, smooth stone, a blue jay's feather, a misshapen wildflower. He would place them on the stump where she sat to mend clothes, never saying a word, darting away before she could thank him. One afternoon, as she was collecting eggs, he finally spoke. His voice was small and clear. "Are you staying?" The question hung in the air, so direct and full of a child's simple need for certainty. Clara's heart gave a painful lurch. She looked down at the boy, at his serious, hopeful face. I hope to," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. He seemed to accept this. A few days later, he asked another question. "Do you know how to make a whistle from a reed?" She did not, but they spent the better part of an hour by the creek, trying and failing, their shared frustration eventually dissolving into the boy's first tentative peal of laughter. It was a sound so rare and beautiful, it made her want to weep. It was through Nate that she learned about Elijah. The boy spoke of his mother, Sarah, in brief, fragmented memories. "Ma used to sing to the chickens," he said one day. Another time, while watching Elijah mend a broken bridle, he offered, "Pa does not talk much since Ma went to heaven." Clara pieced together the story from these childish pronouncements and her own quiet observations. Sarah had died giving birth to Nate. The silence that now filled the cabin was not Elijah's nature, but a heavy cloak of grief he had wrapped around himself 7 years ago and never taken off. The knowledge settled deep inside her, a sorrow that was not her own, but that she felt nonetheless. It explained the guardedness in his eyes, the profound loneliness that seemed to cling to him even when he was not alone. She started seeing signs of a hidden tenderness in him, small acts of care that were as quiet as he was. She found Nate's little wooden horse, the one he always carried, with its broken leg carefully glued and wrapped with a thin strip of leather. She knew it was Elijah's work. Sometimes, after a particularly meager egg collection, an extra one would mysteriously appear in the basket, and one morning, after a night when the temperature had plummeted, she awoke to find a heavy sheepskin vest, worn and smelling faintly of Elijah, laid over her blankets. He never acknowledged these things, and she never dared to ask. Their communication was a language of gestures, of things left unsaid but deeply understood. The fragile peace of their isolated world was shattered one Tuesday by the arrival of a visitor. A man on a stout gray horse rode up to the cabin. He was dressed in black, a preacher by the look of him. Elijah, who had been splitting logs, stopped his work, his axe resting in his hands. His body was tense, a wall between the cabin and the newcomer. Clara, who had been shaking out a blanket, saw the man and her blood ran cold. An outsider, a connection to the world she had fled. Instinct took over. She ducked behind the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs, and peered through a crack in the logs. "Mr. Kane," the preacher said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet air. "Reverend Davies, just making my rounds, checking on the flock." Elijah said nothing. He just stood there, his silence a more effective deterrent than any threat. The preacher cleared his throat, clearly unsettled. "Heard you had a hard winter. Wanted to make sure you and the boy were faring well." His eyes scanned the small homestead. and then they widened in surprise as they fell upon the blanket Clara had dropped, and then the woman's dress hanging on the washing line. "Well, I see you have some help now. That is good. A woman's touch is a blessing in a home." Elijah's voice, when it came, was flat and cold. "We are fine, Reverend." It was a clear dismissal. Reverend Davies, flustered, offered a clumsy blessing, turned his horse, and rode away. Casting a few curious glances back at the cabin, Clara remained hidden until he was a small dot on the horizon. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. He had seen the dress. He knew a woman was living here, a widower and an unmarried woman, alone. She knew what people would say. Her fears were realized a week later. The flour sack was nearly empty, and she had used the last of the thread mending Nate's shirt. There was no avoiding a trip to the nearest town, a small, dusty settlement called Dry Creek. Elijah was gone for the day, checking on the cattle in the upper pasture. Clara, telling herself it was better if she went alone, that her presence would cause less talk than if she arrived with Elijah, scribbled a short list, took the few coins Elijah kept in a jar for supplies, and began the long walk to town. The town was a shock to her system after the quiet solitude of the ranch. The main street was a flurry of wagons, horses, and people. The air was thick with the smells of dust, manure, and cooking food. Women in bonnets bustled along the wooden boardwalk, while men in dusty hats gathered in front of the saloon. Clara kept her head down, her shawl pulled tightly around her face, and hurried toward the mercantile. She was just stepping inside when a voice called out her name. "Clara? Clara May!" She froze, her hand on the door. She turned to see a young woman with garishly painted cheeks and tired eyes standing in the doorway of the saloon. Betsy. She had worked for a time in the saloon, and had sometimes come to the merchant's camp to trade gossip and whiskey. "I thought that was you," Betsy said, a sly smile spreading across her face. "Heard you ran off. Old man Hemlock was fit to be tied." Her eyes raked over Clara's simple, mended dress. "So, this is where you ended up. Heard Elijah Kane took in a stray. Did not figure he was the type, so quiet and all." She winked. "Guess the quiet ones have their needs, too." The implication was as sharp and ugly as a slap. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Whispers had already begun to follow her down the street. Now, they had a name. They had a story. A sordid, twisted version of the truth. "You are mistaken," Clara mumbled, and fled into the store, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening fear. She bought the flour and thread, barely meeting the shopkeeper's curious gaze, and practically ran out of town, the whispers seeming to chase her all the way back to the ranch. She had brought the town's poison back with her. She had tainted this small sanctuary. She would ruin Elijah's name, bring shame upon him and his son. He had saved her, and she would repay him with scandal. She could not bear it. That night, she made her decision. While Elijah and Nate slept, she gathered her few possessions. The dress she had arrived in, now washed and mended. The sheepskin vest, the tin of salve. She paused, her hand hovering over the vest. It was his. She could not take it. She folded it neatly and placed it at the foot of his bed. She wrote a note on a scrap of paper, her hand shaking. "Thank you. I am sorry." She propped it against the salt cellar on the table. Then, quietly, she slipped out of the cabin and into the cold, moonless night. She would not bring trouble to this house. She would disappear. She did not get far. She had been walking for perhaps an hour, following the faint dirt track that led away from the ranch, when she heard the sound of a horse behind her. She did not need to turn around. She knew who it was. She started to run, a foolish, desperate attempt, but the horse easily caught up to her. Elijah dismounted, his tall frame a dark, imposing silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He did not look angry. He simply stood in her path, blocking her way. The horse, a big roan, snorted softly, its breath pluming in the cold air. "Let me go," she pleaded, her voice choked with tears. "I will bring you nothing but trouble. You heard the preacher. They are talking in town. They will ruin you because of me." He did not answer. He just stood there, watching her. Then, he reached out and took the small bundle from her hands. He turned and tied it to his saddle. He took the horse's reins in one hand. With the other, he took her arm, his grip firm but not harsh. He started walking back toward the cabin, leading the horse, and pulling her gently but inexorably along with him. He did not say a single word the entire way. The next morning, the silence in the cabin was heavier than ever. Nate seemed to sense the tension and was unusually quiet. Clara could not eat. She could not look at Elijah. Finally, when Nate had gone outside to play, she could not bear it any longer. She had to understand. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. "Why did you come for me?" Elijah was cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not stop, did not look up at her. The seconds ticked by, each one a small eternity. She thought he would not answer. Then, he laid the cleaning rag aside and finally met her gaze. His eyes were clear, his expression unwavering. "You belong home," he said. The words were simple, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. Not here, but home. He had claimed her, not as a possession, but as a part of this place, a part of his life. A tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time, it was not a tear of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, heart-stopping gratitude. That night, a storm rolled in. It came suddenly, a violent onslaught of wind, rain, and thunder that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in stark, flashing moments of white. Nate, frightened, crawled into his father's bed. Clara lay on her pallet, listening to the fury of the storm, feeling a strange kinship with its wildness. She must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, she was screaming. A crack of thunder, louder than all the rest, had ripped through her dreams, dragging her back to a night of terror in the merchant's wagon, to the sound of the whip, to the feeling of powerlessness. She sat bolt upright, a strangled cry caught in her throat, her body trembling. In the next flash of lightning, she saw him. Elijah was standing over her. He had his heavy wool coat in his hands. He leaned down and gently draped it over her shaking shoulders. It was warm and smelled of him, of pine smoke in the cold night air. The simple weight of it was comforting, an anchor in her fear. His hand rested on her shoulder as he tucked the coat around her. It was a large, calloused hand, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He did not pull away immediately. For a long, breathless moment, his hand lingered there, his thumb stroking the fabric of her shift just once, a slow, deliberate movement. In the darkness of the cabin, with the storm raging outside, it was the most intimate touch she had ever known. It was not a demand, it was a comfort, a promise, and something more, something that sparked a slow, deep warmth inside her that had nothing to do with the coat. Then, as quietly as he had come, he retreated to his own bed, leaving her wrapped in his scent, his warmth, and the deafening beat of her own heart. The seasons turned, and the land, once a frozen, hostile stranger, became a familiar, demanding partner. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a muddy, messy thaw that turned the ranch into a quagmire. But with the mud came the first green shoots of grass and a softening in the relentless wind. Clara felt the change not just in the air, but within herself. The hard, physical labor had carved new lines into her body. Her shoulders, once thin and stooped, were now square and strong. Her hands, though perpetually rough and chapped, moved with a newfound competence and certainty. The fear that had lived for so long in the pit of her stomach had not vanished, but it had receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a quiet shoreline of resolve. Elijah must have noticed the change, too. One morning, instead of heading out to the pastures alone, he paused at the door and looked at her. He held up a coil of rope. It was not a question, but an invitation, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer a fragile guest to be sheltered, but a part of this place. She followed him out into the pale morning light, her heart beating a little faster. He began to let her work alongside him. He taught her, in his wordless way, how to mend the barbed wire fences that were their first line of defense against the vast, hungry wilderness. He would stretch the wire taut, his muscles straining, and hand her the pliers. She learned by watching his hands, by mimicking his efficient, deliberate movements. He showed her how to spot a cow that was ailing, how to lead a stubborn calf back to its mother. He never offered praise, but sometimes, after she had successfully completed a task, she would catch him watching her, his expression thoughtful, the guard in his eyes lowered just a fraction. He decided she needed to learn to ride. The roan he brought for her was an old mare with a calm, patient demeanor and one floppy ear. Clara was terrified. Her only experience with horses had been from the back of the merchant's wagon, a place of misery and fear. The sheer size and power of the animal up close was overwhelming. "I cannot," she said, backing away as Elijah held out the reins. He did not argue or insist. He simply stood beside the horse, his hand resting on its neck, and waited. His patience was a force more powerful than any command. Taking a shaky breath, Clara slowly approached. He showed her how to put her foot in the stirrup, his hand briefly steadying her back as she awkwardly hauled herself into the saddle. She felt a jolt of warmth at his touch, a feeling she quickly pushed away. He led her around the small corral for what felt like hours, the old mare plodding along placidly. He walked beside her, his presence a silent assurance. Slowly, the terror in her chest began to loosen its grip, replaced by a tentative sense of wonder. She was high off the ground, seeing the world from a new perspective. By the end of the day, he had her holding the reins herself, her knuckles white but her back straight. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Their new proximity created a different kind of tension. They worked for hours in a shared silence, the only sounds the wind, the lowing of the cattle, and the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the space between them. Once a vast gulf, had shrunk to the length of a fence post, the width of a horse. It was an intimacy built not on words, but on shared labor, on the simple, honest reality of two people striving to hold a small piece of the world together. One afternoon, they were clearing deadfall from the creek bed, the result of a violent spring storm. A large, half-rotten log was wedged between two boulders. Elijah was using a thick branch as a lever, his back and shoulders straining with the effort. Clara was on the other side, pulling at loose branches. Suddenly, with a loud crack, the log shifted, rolling unexpectedly toward her. There was no time to think. She saw the immense weight of it tumbling down, and she froze. In a blur of motion, Elijah launched himself at her, tackling her out of the way. They landed in a heap on the damp, mossy bank, his body shielding hers. The log crashed into the spot where she had been standing just a second before, the impact shaking the ground. For a moment, they just lay there, breathless. The world was a jumble of sensations. The damp, earthy smell of the creek bank, the hard muscle of his chest pressed against her back, the thunder of her own heart in her ears. He was heavy on top of her, a solid, protective weight. She could feel the warmth of his body through her thin dress. He pushed himself up on his elbows, looking down at her. His face was inches from hers. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide and dark, filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she could not name. He was looking at her, really looking at her, not as a stray he had taken in, not as a pair of hands to help with the work, but as a woman. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said. She saw his gaze drop to her lips, and her own breath caught in her throat. Then, as quickly as it had appeared. The moment was gone. He blinked, and the mask of stoic indifference fell back into place. He scrambled to his feet, pulling away from her as if he had been burned. He offered her a hand up, his touch impersonal, his face averted. He did not speak. He just turned back to the fallen log, his shoulders tense, and went back to work, leaving Clara standing there, her body still humming from the impact of their fall. That night, she dreamed of him. The dreams were a confusing tangle of fear and longing. She was back in the merchant's wagon, the whip raised, but when she looked up, it was Elijah's face she saw, his expression pained. Then the scene would shift, and they would be by the creek again, his body covering hers, his touch no longer just protective, but possessive, claiming. She would wake with a gasp, her skin tingling, her heart aching with a loneliness and a desire so profound it frightened her. The whispers in Dry Creek had not faded. They had grown, nurtured by gossip and boredom, into a full-blown story. The Kane widower had taken a fallen woman to his bed. She was a harlot run out of Cheyenne, a thief who had escaped her last keeper. Every version of the story was uglier than the last. Clara felt the stares every time she had to go to the mercantile. The women would fall silent as she entered, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and contempt. One afternoon, a woman named Martha Gable, whose husband owned a small parcel of land bordering Elijah's, cornered her near the flour barrels. Mrs. Gable was a stern, thin-lipped woman who considered herself the town's moral compass. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said, her voice low and venomous, so only Clara could hear. "Living in sin with that man, bringing your filth into a home with a child." A decent woman would not carry on so. Clara tried to walk away, her face burning with shame. "But Mrs." Gable stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Everyone knows what you are," she hissed, her voice rising now, attracting the attention of the other customers. "You are nothing but a whore." Something inside Clara snapped. It was not the scared, cowering girl who reacted. It was the woman who had survived a freezing night in the wild, the woman who had learned to mend fences and ride a horse. It was a woman who had, for the first time in her life, found a place that felt like home, and she would not let this woman, or anyone, defile it. Without thinking, she swung the empty metal pail she was carrying. It connected with the side of Mrs. Gable's head with a loud, hollow clang. The woman staggered back, her hand flying to her face, a look of utter shock in her eyes. The store fell into a stunned silence. Then, Mrs. Gable let out a shriek of outrage. The sheriff, a portly, tired-looking man named Jedediah, was called. Clara was dragged, unresisting, to his small, dusty office. She did not say a word in her own defense. What was the point? They had already judged her. She sat on a hard wooden bench, waiting for whatever came next, a strange, numb calm settling over her. An hour later, Elijah walked in. His face was grim, his jaw set. He did not look at her. He spoke to the sheriff, his voice low and even. Clara could not hear the words, but she saw him place a few silver coins on the desk. "The fine." The sheriff nodded, and Elijah turned and walked out. He paused in the doorway and looked at her. It was not a command, but she knew she was to follow. The ride back to the ranch was a long, suffocating silence. Clara braced herself for the anger, for the questions, for the inevitable moment when he would tell her to pack her things. She had repaid his kindness by brawling in the street like a common drunk. She had brought public shame to his doorstep. But he said nothing. When they reached the cabin, he unsaddled his horse and went about his evening chores as if nothing had happened. The lack of condemnation was almost worse than an outburst. That night, she could not stay in the cabin. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She fled to the barn, the one place she felt she could breathe. She sank down into the hay. The familiar, dusty smell, a small comfort. And finally, Let the tears come. She wept for the humiliation, for the injustice of it all, but mostly, she wept because she had failed him. She had proven the gossips right. She was trouble. The barn door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of pale moonlight onto the floor. Elijah stood in the doorway, a tall, silent silhouette. He walked over and sat down in the hay a few feet away from her. He did not speak. He just sat there, his presence a solid, grounding force in the darkness. He was sharing her shame, her sorrow, just by being there. Slowly, her sobs subsided. In the quiet that followed, she felt a desperate need to connect, to bridge the silent gap between them. She reached out, her hand trembling, and laid it gently on his. His reaction was swift and sharp. He pulled his hand away as if her touch had burned him. A sudden, flinching movement. He stood up, his body rigid, but it was not anger she saw on his face in the dim light. It was fear, a deep, profound fear that mirrored her own. He looked down at her, his expression a chaotic mix of emotions she could not decipher, before he turned and strode out of the barn, leaving her alone once more. The next few days were excruciating. An awkward, painful silence hung between them. He avoided her eyes. She flinched every time she accidentally brushed past him in the small cabin. She was sure he was just waiting for the right moment to send her away. One evening, she was washing the supper dishes in a basin of hot water. He came to stand by the hearth, stoking the fire. The space was small, and as she turned from the basin, her arm brushed against his. They both froze. Her heart leaped into her throat. She looked up, and for the first time in days, their eyes met and held. The air crackled with unspoken tension. She saw the memory of the creek, of the barn, reflected in his dark, stormy eyes. He was the one who broke the silence. His voice was a low, rough whisper, so quiet she almost did not hear it. "You are not what they say." The words were a balm on her raw, wounded soul. He did not believe them. He saw her, the real her, beneath the rumors and the shame, emboldened by his defense of her. She dared to ask the question that had been tormenting her. "Do you want me to leave?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He did not answer right away. He just looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. The silence stretched, and her hope began to wither. She had pushed too far. She had demanded too much. She lowered her head, ready for the blow. "Then, finally," he answered. His voice was firm, resolute, leaving no room for doubt. "No." The word was not a promise, but a foundation. No, with that single syllable, Elijah Kane had laid a stone in the shifting soil of Clara's life. Something solid she could stand on. And for the first time in years, she began to sleep through the night. The nightmares did not vanish entirely, but they lost their sharp edges, retreating to the shadows of her mind. She would wake not to a jolt of terror, but to the gentle gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin window, to the sound of Nate's soft breathing, to the quiet knowledge that she was safe. She was home. This newfound peace settled into her bones, straightening her spine, softening the haunted look in her eyes. The work was still hard, the days still long, but they were her own. They were not a debt she was paying, but a life she was building. One bucket of water, one mended shirt, one loaf of slightly less burnt bread at a time. Nate was the first to give her a new name. One morning, as she was handing him a piece of bread and jam, he looked up at her with his solemn, dark eyes and said, "Thank you, Miss Clara." The title was formal, respectful, and it struck her with a quiet force. She was no longer just the stray, the woman who had appeared from the wilderness. She was Miss Clara. She had an identity here, one that was not defined by her past, but by her present. She had to turn away quickly to hide the sudden sting of tears in her eyes. With this small bloom of confidence, Clara felt a stirring of something she had long suppressed, a desire to feel like a woman again. In a dusty corner of the mercantile, she had found a bolt of cheap calico fabric, printed with small, faded blue flowers. It was an indulgence, paid for with a few coins she had earned by selling some extra eggs. But it felt like a necessity. For weeks. In the quiet evenings after Nate was asleep, she worked by the light of the fire, her needle flashing. She cut and stitched, transforming the simple fabric into a dress. It was not fashionable or fine, but it was clean and new. And it was hers. One Sunday morning, she put it on. The fabric was crisp against her skin, the fit snug around her stronger frame. She braided her hair and tied it with a scrap of the same material. When she stepped out of the small alcove where she slept, both Elijah and Nate stopped what they were doing and stared. Nate's mouth fell open in a smile of wonder. But it was Elijah's reaction that made her heart stop. He did not just glance at her. He looked. His eyes traveled from the braid in her hair, down the line of her throat, over the new dress that showed the gentle curve of her hips, and back up to her face. For a long, silent moment, the ever-present guard in his eyes fell away completely, replaced by a raw, naked appreciation that made her skin tingle and a blush creep up her neck. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hunger. Then, as if realizing he had revealed too much, he gave a slight jerk, his expression shuddering once more. He turned away abruptly, picked up a pail, and strode out of the cabin without a word, leaving Clara standing in a swirl of pleasure, confusion, and a new, aching disappointment. The uneasy peace they had found was tested by the outside world once more. A neighboring rancher, a man named Silas Croft, began to make a habit of stopping by. He was a widower himself, a stout, florid man with a booming voice and a self-satisfied air. He would bring Nate sweets and engage Clara in conversation, ignoring Elijah's pointed silence. Clara was polite but distant, unsettled by the proprietary way he looked at her. One afternoon, Croft found her alone near the barn, mending a leather strap. Elijah was out on the range. "Miss Clara," he began, removing his hat with a flourish. "A woman like you, it is not right you should be living this way, without a name, without protection." He puffed out his chest. "Folks in town, they talk, but I am a man who makes his own judgments. You have a good heart, a strong back. I am in need of a wife. I would be willing to give you my name, make an honest woman of you. My children need a mother." The offer, couched in the language of chivalry, was a profound insult. He was not offering her a home. He was offering her a bargain, a way to scrub the stain of her past with the legitimacy of his name. She was a piece of property to be acquired, a solution to his domestic problems. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice tight and cold. "But I am not in need of a new name." "Now, do not be hasty," he said, stepping closer. "A woman cannot make her way alone. Cain is a good man, but he cannot offer you what I can. He lives in the past. I am offering you a future." He reached out to take her arm. She said no. The voice was low and flat, coming from the corner of the barn. Elijah stood there, his face like a thundercloud. He must have returned without them hearing. Croft dropped his hand. Startled, he forced a jovial laugh. "Cain, just having a friendly chat with the lady, making her a respectable offer, is all something you seem unwilling to do." Elijah did not respond with words. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and drove his fist into Silas Croft's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack. Croft stumbled backward, tripped over his own feet, and landed in a heap in the dust. Blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He stared up at Elijah in stunned disbelief. Elijah stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. He looked like a wolf defending its territory. He did not say another word. He just stared Croft down until the man scrambled to his feet, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and scurried over to his horse. muttering curses under his breath. He rode off without a backward glance. Clara was shaking. She had never seen such violence from Elijah. It was a raw, primal display of possession that was both frightening and thrilling. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her in front of another man. That night, after Nate was asleep, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not empty, but full of the unspoken events of the day. Elijah sat at the table, cleaning a lantern, his knuckles bruised and swollen. Clara finally found the courage to speak. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes dark. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He put down the lantern and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of weariness she had never seen before. "Because men like him, they think they can own anything that does not have a brand on it." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I did not want him to own you." It was the most he had said to her at one time. A crack had appeared in the wall of his silence, and she felt a desperate urge to see what was behind it. "What about your wife?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Nate? He says you do not talk much since she passed." His face tightened, the familiar mask of grief descending. She thought he would shut down, retreat back into his silence, but he did not. He looked into the fire, his gaze distant. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice rough. She was like the sun, bright, warm. This place was different when she was here." He paused, swallowing hard. The birth was hard. The doctor was 2 days' ride away. By the time he got here, it was too late. He fell silent, but this time, Clara could hear the words he was not saying. "He told people in town I should have gone for him sooner," Elijah continued, his voice barely a whisper, "that I waited too long. Her mother, she said I worked her too hard, that I brought her out to this God-forsaken place and killed her with it." He closed his eyes. "They all looked at me like I was a murderer, so I stopped talking to them. It was easier." Clara's heart ached for him. She finally understood the depth of his isolation. It was not just grief. It was a profound, lonely guilt, laid upon him by a world that needed someone to blame. She moved to the table and sat across from him. She did not touch him. She just sat there, a silent witness to his pain. The confession changed something between them. The tension was still there, but now it was laced with a fragile thread of understanding. It built in the small moments. The way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin, the way his fingers would brush against hers when she handed him a cup of coffee, a touch that lingered just a second too long. It was a slow, aching dance of longing and restraint. One night, another storm blew in, a mirror of the one that had come weeks before. The wind howled around the cabin, and rain lashed against the window pane. Nate was asleep, oblivious. Elijah sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, his face cast in shadow. Clara, unable to sleep, got up and poured him a cup of coffee. She brought it to him, her hand unsteady. He looked up as she approached, his eyes catching the firelight. He took the cup from her, his fingers closing over hers. He did not let go. He set the cup on the floor beside him and, with his other hand, took her wrist, gently pulling her down to kneel in front of him. The world seemed to shrink to the space between their faces. The storm outside faded to a dull roar. All she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart. In silence, he leaned in. His lips met hers, not with force, but with a slow, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss of infinite sadness and desperate hope. It was hesitant, questioning, as if he were rediscovering a long-forgotten language. A soft moan escaped her lips, a sound of surrender and release. Instinctively, she raised her hand and laid it flat against his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The touch broke the spell. He pulled back suddenly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His face was a mask of conflict and pain. "You are not ready," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He shook his head. "Or I am not." He stood up and moved to the far side of the cabin, turning his back to her, his shoulders rigid. Clara knelt on the floor, the warmth of his lips still on hers, her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. She had misunderstood. He was ashamed. He had kissed her and found her wanting, a poor replacement for the woman he had lost. The pain was sharper than any whip, a deep, internal wound that left her cold and empty. The days that followed were a return to the awkward, painful silence. He would not meet her eyes. She moved around him like a ghost, the memory of that brief, tender kiss a constant, bitter torment. Then, Nate got sick. It started with a cough, then a fever that left him flushed and listless. By the second night, he was delirious, muttering in his sleep, his small body burning with heat. The nearest doctor was days away, and a new storm had made the roads impassable. They were on their own. All the tension and awkwardness between Clara and Elijah dissolved, replaced by a single, shared terror. He rode out into the storm to find herbs the local natives used for fever. Clara stayed by Nate's bedside, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, whispering soothing words she was not sure he could even hear. She did not sleep for 2 days. She sat in a small wooden chair, her entire world narrowed to the small, feverish boy in the cot. She prayed to the God she had long abandoned, making desperate bargains in the dark. She wept silently, her tears falling onto the boy's tangled hair. This small, serious child had crept into her heart, and the thought of losing him was an agony she could not bear. On the 3rd morning, the fever finally broke. Nate's skin was cool to the touch, his breathing even and deep. He was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, exhausted. Clara sagged in her chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand still holding his. She was drifting in a haze of exhaustion when she felt a gentle touch on her head. She looked up. Elijah was standing over them, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep. He had been watching her. He had seen her weeping, had heard her whispered prayers. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Not desire, not grief, but a look of profound, heart-wrenching gratitude. Something inside him seemed to break. He leaned down, and, for a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her again. But he did not. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a touch as soft as a prayer, a gesture of reverence and benediction. He pulled back, his eyes shining with unshed tears. His voice was a raw, broken whisper. "Don't leave us." His words, "Don't leave us," were not a command, but a plea that dismantled the last of Clara's defenses. The fever that had threatened to take Nate had burned away the lingering awkwardness between them, leaving behind a raw and tender honesty. In the quiet days of the boy's recovery, a new rhythm settled over the cabin. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken grief or tension, but comfortable, charged with a deep and abiding awareness of each other. Their relationship, while still chaste, became one of soft, incidental touches. When Clara handed Elijah a plate, his fingers would deliberately brush against hers, a silent acknowledgement that lingered long after the contact was broken. When he passed behind her in the small cabin, his hand would rest for a fleeting moment on the small of her back, a gesture of quiet possession and reassurance. They moved around each other not as two separate souls sharing a space, but as two halves of a whole, their orbits intrinsically linked. He started to smile at her. Small, rare things that barely turned up the corners of his mouth but lit his eyes with a warmth that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. This new, fragile intimacy gave Clara the courage she needed to unburden herself of the last of her secrets. She knew that if they were to have any kind of future, he had to know the full, ugly truth of her past. She could not build a life on a foundation of unspoken shame. One evening, as they sat on the small porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, she took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was low and unsteady at first, a mere whisper against the chirping of the crickets. She told him everything. She spoke of the merchant, Hemlock, of his initial false kindness that had soured into a grim proprietorship. She told him of the beatings, of the way he would lock her in the wagon for days, of the leering men he would bring to the camp to look her over like livestock. She confessed, her voice cracking, the things he had forced her to endure in the dark, the quiet humiliations that had stripped her of her own sense of self, leaving her feeling like a soiled, broken thing. She told him of the night she had fled, of his threat to sell her to a man who ran a brothel in a mining camp, a place from which no woman ever returned. She told him of her despair, of how, during that first freezing night in the wilderness, she had wanted to simply lie down and let the cold take her. "I wanted to die," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I thought it would be better than being found. When I saw your cabin, I did not know if I was running towards salvation or just another kind of hell." She finally fell silent, her story laid bare between them. She did not dare to look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on her own hands, which were twisted into a knot in her lap. She expected to see disgust in his eyes, or pity, which was somehow worse. She waited for him to pull away, for the new warmth between them to turn to ice. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound his steady breathing. Then he reached over and took her hands, his large, calloused palms completely enveloping hers. He gently unlaced her clenched fingers, holding them firmly. She finally looked up at him. There was no disgust in his eyes, no pity. There was only a fierce, protective anger directed not at her, but at the world that had hurt her. "That past is dead," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He gave her hands a gentle squeeze. "You are here now." It was an absolution. With those few simple words, he had taken the heavy, rotting corpse of her past and buried it. He did not ask for details. He did not dwell on the horror. He simply declared it over. He had seen the ugliest parts of her, and he had not flinched. He had held her hands and told her she was home. Later that night, the air in the cabin was thick with a new, palpable longing. Every glance held a deeper meaning. Every silence was filled with 1,000 unspoken words. After Nate was sound asleep, Elijah took her hand and led her not to her pallet by the fire, but out into the cool, star-dusted night and toward the barn. He led her up the rough-hewn ladder to the hayloft. Moonlight streamed through the high, open window, illuminating the space in a soft, silver glow. The air was sweet with the smell of dry hay and old wood. He did not speak. He did not have to. She saw the question, the desire, the reverence in his eyes, and for the first time, she was not afraid. She answered with a small nod, a complete and total surrender not to him, but to the love that had grown so quietly and fiercely between them. He undressed her slowly, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as they unbuttoned her dress, as they pushed the straps of her chemise from her shoulders. He treated her body not as an object of lust, but as something precious, something to be cherished. He kissed the scars on her back, his lips a soft, healing balm on the raised, ropey lines left by the merchant's whip. When they finally came together in the soft bed of hay, it was a slow, emotional collision of two broken, lonely souls. It was an act not of taking, but of giving. It was a silent conversation, a language of touch that spoke of comfort, of safety, of a fierce and desperate need to be close, to erase the years of solitude. In the midst of it, as the intensity built, a sob broke from Clara's throat. Tears she had held back for years began to stream down her face, tears for the pain she had endured, for the girl she had been, for the love she had never thought she would find. She cried, and he held her, his movement slowing, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tightly as if to shield her from the memories. He held her through it, whispering her name against her skin until her tears subsided, replaced by a profound and shuddering release that was as much about healing as it was about pleasure. The next morning, She awoke to the unfamiliar feeling of a soft mattress beneath her. She was in Elijah's bed in the cabin. The spot beside her was empty, but the pillow still held the faint indentation of his head. Sunlight streamed into the room, and the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. On the small table beside the bed, a single cup of coffee was waiting for her, steam rising in a lazy curl. He was already out, working, but he had thought of her. The small, simple gesture filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She was not a secret to be hidden in the hayloft. He had brought her into his bed, into the heart of his home. They fell into a new life, one that resembled that of a family. They ate their meals together, worked side by side, and in the evenings sat together by the fire, Nate often leaning his sleepy head against Clara's lap. At night, she no longer slept on the pallet on the floor, but in Elijah's bed, curled against his solid, warm back. Their nights were tender, a quiet rediscovery of intimacy, but it was the days that truly cemented their bond. They were a unit, a small, self-contained world of three against the vast, unforgiving landscape. But their quiet happiness was a beacon in the dull, gossip-starved world of Dry Creek. The rumors, which had been simmering for months, now boiled over. The sight of Elijah and Clara coming to town together, a quiet understanding radiating between them, was all the confirmation the town needed. The story of the harlot who had bewitched the grieving widower was told with righteous indignation over sewing circles and saloon bars. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon finally broke on a hot, dusty Tuesday. Clara and Elijah were in the mercantile when the door swung open, and a man strode in, bringing with him a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He was a large man with a florid face, small, greedy eyes, and a cruel set to his mouth. It was Hemlock. Clara's blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the sounds of the store fading to a dull roar in her ears. He had found her. He looked around the store, his eyes landing on her, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "There you are, my girl," he said, his voice oozing a false warmth that made her skin crawl. "Led me on quite a chase." Elijah moved to stand slightly in front of her, a silent, solid shield. "She is not your girl," he said, his voice dangerously low. Hemlock laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, she is, and I have the papers to prove it." He turned to the sheriff, who had followed him into the store. "Sheriff, I have an indenture contract here, signed and legal, for one Clara May. She is my property, and she absconded. I want her back." He held out a piece of paper. The sheriff, a man who preferred to avoid trouble, took the paper and looked it over, his brow furrowed. "This seems to be in order, Mr. Hemlock." He looked at Elijah, then at Clara, who was pale and trembling behind him. "Elijah, the law is the law. An indenture is a binding contract." "It is a lie," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "He forced me to sign it. He told me it was for wages." "A woman's word against a signed document?" Hemlock sneered. "I think we all know which holds up in court." Elijah did not look at the paper. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked directly at Hemlock. "You are not taking her," he said. It was not a debate. It was a statement of fact. The sheriff sighed, clearly caught in the middle. "Now, Elijah, let us not have any trouble. If the paper is legal, my hands are tied. You will have to hand her over." The confrontation was interrupted when Hemlock, seeking to press his advantage, came to the ranch the next day. He rode up bold as brass, the sheriff trailing reluctantly behind him. Clara, who had been in the cabin, saw him coming and her heart seized with a paralyzing terror. Elijah was chopping wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. He did not stop as they approached. "Cain," Hemlock shouted, "I am here for what is mine. Send the girl out now." and we will avoid any unpleasantness." Elijah stopped, the axe resting on the chopping block. He looked at Hemlock, his face completely devoid of expression. He said nothing. He simply turned, walked into the cabin, and emerged a moment later with his rifle. He did not raise it. He just held it, cradled in the crook of his arm. The message was unmistakable. Hemlock's bravado faltered. He looked at the rifle, then at Elijah's cold, unyielding eyes, and seemed to think better of his demands. "This is not over," he snarled. "I will have the law on my side." He turned his horse and rode off, the sheriff giving Elijah a weary, apologetic shrug before following. That night, the sheriff rode out alone. "He is pressing the matter. Elijah," he said, his voice grave. "He has petitioned the circuit judge. There will be a hearing. A legal fight is coming, and the law is often on the side of the man with the paper." When he had gone, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Clara's old instinct, the one that had kept her alive for so long, screamed at her to run. She would not be the reason Elijah lost everything, or worse, got himself killed. While he was outside, she began to pack a small bag with bread and a canteen of water. She would slip away in the night, draw Hemlock after her, and lead him away from this place. She would sacrifice herself to save the man she loved. She was just about to leave when the cabin door opened. Elijah stood there, his face grim. He saw the bag in her hand, and his expression hardened, but not with anger. It was with a deep, wrenching pain. "You were going to run again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To protect you," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot let him hurt you. I will not be the reason this home is destroyed." He crossed the room in 2 strides and took the bag from her hand, dropping it to the floor. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me, Clara," he said, his voice fierce and low. "My home was already destroyed once. I will not let it happen again." He looked deep into her eyes, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "You do not run from this. We do not run from this. We fight together now." The word hung in the air between them. It was a vow, a promise, a declaration of a bond that no legal paper could sever. He was no longer just her protector. He was her partner. The next morning, they rode to town. Elijah saddled both horses. As they prepared to leave, he reached down and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not let go. Hand in hand, they rode down the dusty track that led to Dry Creek, their faces set, their backs straight. They rode into the heart of the town, past the staring, whispering faces of the townsfolk. A silent, defiant couple, ready to face whatever came their way, together. The circuit judge had set up court in the town's largest saloon, the air thick with the stale smell of whiskey and sawdust, a profane setting for a trial of souls. The room was packed, a gallery of curious, judgmental faces all turned toward Clara. She stood before a makeshift bench, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She wore the simple blue calico dress, her one good thing, and it felt like armor, thin and fragile as it was. Hemlock was in his element. He paced before the judge, a portly, silver-haired man with weary eyes, and painted a masterful portrait of himself as a benevolent, wronged man. He spoke of Clara as a charity case, a girl he had taken in from the street, fed and clothed out of the goodness of his heart. He produced the indenture contract, waving it like a holy text. "She was a wayward girl, Your Honor," Hemlock said, his voice dripping with false piety. "Prone to hysterics and untruths. I tried to guide her, to give her honest work. In return for my kindness, she stole supplies from my wagon and fled in the night. A common thief." His voice dropped, becoming confiding, poisonous, and I'm afraid her morals were as loose as her gratitude. She had a reputation. A man has to protect his property and his good name. He turned his gaze on Clara, a cruel smirk on his lips. He was shaming her, stripping her down in front of the entire town. just as he had done in the dark confines of his wagon. She felt the heat of 100 stares, felt the weight of their judgment, the whispers of whore and thief that had followed her for months were now being given the weight of legal testimony. She felt herself begin to shrink, the old, familiar terror coiling in her belly. Then she felt a presence behind her. Elijah had moved from his seat to stand directly at her back. He did not touch her. He did not speak, but his nearness was a fortress. She could feel the solid, unwavering strength of him, a silent declaration that she was not alone. She took a slow, deep breath, straightened her spine, and lifted her chin. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was a reedy, trembling thing at first. She looked at the judge, forcing herself to meet his tired gaze. "My name is Clara May," she began. "I was not a charity case. I was his servant. I worked for my keep, and I was not paid a wage. The paper he told me it was a work agreement. I cannot read, Your Honor. I signed my name where he told me to." She recounted the night she had fled, her voice growing stronger as the truth spilled out. "He struck me. He told me he was going to sell me to another man. I did not steal anything. I ran for my life." Hemlock laughed, a dismissive, ugly sound. "The desperate lies of a cornered animal, Your Honor. It is her word against a legal document." The judge looked from Clara's earnest, frightened face to Hemlock's smug one. He sighed, a man caught between the letter of the law and the feeling in his gut. "It is a difficult situation. A signed contract is a powerful thing." It was then that a voice cut through the tense silence of the room. "He is lying." All heads turned. A woman stood in the doorway, her figure thin and wiry. She was dressed in worn, travel-stained clothes, her face etched with hardship, but her eyes burned with a fierce, defiant light. "That man is a liar and a monster," the woman said, her voice ringing with conviction as she walked toward the bench. "And who might you be?" the judge asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. "My name is Abigail Reed," she said. "I worked for Mr. Hemlock 2 years ago, before Clara did. He made me sign a paper, too, told me it was for my wages, and everything she said he did to her. He did to me, the beatings, the threats." Her gaze fell on Hemlock, and it was full of a cold, hard hatred. "I ran from him in Colorado. I heard he had come through this way. I came to warn people about him." A murmur went through the crowd. Hemlock's face had gone pale, his smug confidence dissolving into a panicked sweat. Abigail's testimony was a stone thrown into the still, murky waters of his lies, and the ripples were spreading. She had no reason to lie. She was a stranger to this town, a stranger to Clara. She had only the truth. The judge stared at Hemlock for a long, silent moment. "Mr. Hemlock," he finally said, his voice cold and sharp. "It seems you have a pattern of acquiring servants who feel the need to flee for their lives. This court finds the indenture contract to have been signed under fraudulent pretenses. It is null and void." He banged his gavel, the sound echoing the finality of a nail being driven into a coffin. "Miss May, you are free to go. Mr. Hemlock, I suggest you leave my jurisdiction before I find a reason to look more closely into your business practices." Clara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. It was over. She was free. Elijah's hand came to rest on her arm, steadying her. They walked out of the saloon and into the bright, clear light of day. The town was split. Some faces, like Mrs. Gable's, were pinched with disapproval, unwilling to let go of their juicy scandal. But others looked at her with a newfound respect. They had seen her stand up to a bully. They had seen a good man stand with her. She had not been cowed. She had won. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the peaceful silence of a battle won, of a storm that had passed. When they arrived, Nate ran out to meet them, his small face alight with relief. He threw his arms around Clara's legs, burying his face in the folds of her dress. That evening, as Clara was setting the table for supper, Nate came to her holding up a drawing he had made of 3 stick figures under a lopsided sun. "Look what I made, Ma," he said, his voice casual, unthinking. The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Ma. He had not said it to be profound. He had said it because, in his simple, 7-year-old heart, that is who she had become. She took the drawing from him, her hand trembling. "It is beautiful. Nate," she managed to say, her voice thick. She turned away, pretending to be busy with the stew, so he would not see the sudden, overwhelming flood of tears. Later, when the cabin was dark and quiet, she slipped out to the barn. She sank into the hay, not with sorrow, but with a joy so vast and pure it felt like it might break her open. She wept for the family she never had, for the love she had never known, and for the small boy who had just given her the most precious name in the world. When she returned to the cabin, Elijah was waiting for her. He did not ask why she had been crying. He knew. He simply held out his hand to her, and she took it, and he led her to his bed. Their love-making that night was nothing like the first time. The desperation and the sorrow were gone, replaced by a deep, abiding joy. There was laughter, soft and breathless in the dark. There were whispered words of tenderness. It was not the frantic coming together of 2 people healing their wounds, but the celebratory union of 2 people beginning a life. It was full of unspoken promises, of a future that stretched out before them, bright and full of hope. In the weeks that followed, Clara truly began to call the ranch home. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a belonging. The land was not a place she worked, but a part of who she was. She planted a small garden with seeds she had bought in town, her hands in the rich soil. She felt a sense of ownership, of permanence. That was entirely new. They decided to host a small gathering for their neighbors, a quiet declaration that they were a part of the community, on their own terms. The Crofts and the Gables did not come, but a few other families did, the ones who had offered nods of encouragement in town. They brought pies and jars of preserves. They sat on the porch, the men talking of cattle and the weather, the women of children and gardens. No one mentioned the trial. No one spoke of the past. They simply accepted Clara and Elijah as they were, a family. One morning, Clara woke to a strange, rhythmic sound coming from outside. She pulled on her dress and went to the door. Elijah was sitting on the porch steps in the pale, pre-dawn light. A thick slab of pine held between his knees. He was carving something into it with his knife, the blade moving with slow, deliberate precision. Shavings of wood curled at his feet. She watched him for a moment, the quiet focus on his face, the strength in his hands. He was a man who spoke with his actions, whose love was written not in words, but in deeds. She walked out onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the wood. He looked up and gave her one of his small, rare smiles. She looked at the sign he was carving. The letters were deep and clear, carved with a loving hand. It said, Clara's Ranch. Her breath caught in her throat. Her name. He was carving her name into the heart of this place, making her belonging tangible, permanent, a flicker of her old self. The girl who never believed she deserved anything good surfaced for a moment. "Is it really mine?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. He stopped carving and looked up at her, his eyes full of a deep, unwavering certainty. He reached out and took her hand. "It always was," he answered. The sun was just beginning to crest the hills, spilling gold and rose across the vast, empty land. She leaned into his solid strength, resting her head on his shoulder, his arm coming around to hold her close. They stood together, watching the day being born, watching the light spread across their home, their ranch. She turned her face into his neck, the rough fabric of his shirt scratching her cheek, the familiar scent of him filling her senses. "You never had to say it," she whispered. "I knew," Thank you for listening to our story from the Wild West Campfire channel. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe for more tales, and share your thoughts in English.